This is Booked on Rock. I'm Eric Senich. Our guest is Arthur Lizie, author of Neil Young on Neil Young, Interviews and Encounters. Neil Young on Neil Young, Interviews and Encounters is a revealing anthology of Young's most significant, fascinating, and entertaining discussions, declarations, and dreams, chronicling 50 years of conversations, feature stories, and press conferences. With many interviews widely available for the first time, including new transcriptions and first-time translations into English, the book spans Young's words and ideas from 1967 onward. His early days with Buffalo Springfield, and 1970s harvest-fueled celebrity apex, an artistic rebellion and 1980s commercial dip, and the unexpected 1990s revival as the Godfather of Grunge, through to his multi-decade victory lap as a living legend. Across the decades, Young's own words tells the story as he perpetually reinvents himself as a master of music and film, a technology pioneer and innovator, and a bold political observer and strident environmental advocate. Arthur Lizie is a professor of communication and media studies at Bridgewater State University. He lives in Massachusetts. To hear a playlist of Neil Young, including the music discussed in this episode, just head over to the show notes page. Arthur, thanks so much for being on the podcast. Great to talk to you.
Thank you. Great to be here and talking to you.
You lead the book by debunking this legend that Neil Young doesn't talk to the press, that he's a hippie hermit who barely talks. That's not the case, right?
Right. That's, I guess, what I thought when I went into this research. But as I dug deeper from about 1965 or so up until 2019, 2020, he's done well over 400 interviews. So it wasn't, for me, a case of scrounging around to find out what I wanted to use, but really a process of selection. That's true overall. There are periods from mainly the 70s. He didn't talk very much during the 70s, but once he switched over to Geffen in the early 80s, since then he's been pretty regular talking to people.
Are there any particular interviews that were close calls for you where you had to think about it a lot and finally decide I'm going to leave that out and put something else in?
I did. The original draft that I had, this one's about 400 pages. If I included everything I wanted, it would have been about double that size. I ended up editing a lot of great interviews out, some merely for space, some because they cover similar material for the same time period. But there were a lot of painful choices to be made.
Well, what is true is that Neil is a walking contradiction, and you write that makes telling his story so difficult, but at the same time so fun. He's a story of opposites. Can you talk about why you describe him as a contradiction?
Well, not necessarily to get really political, but politically he's been a major contradiction. Early on, he was certainly associated with the counterculture on his own and part of Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. And at that time period, recording Ohio and getting into songs like Southern Man on his own. So he was considered part of the counterculture. Swing around about 10 years later, and he's supporting Reagan and pro-strong America, America first, getting into country and basically acting like a redneck. So that's in the mid-'80s. He cools off politically until around the turn of the millennium, and he goes pretty much full bore left-wing in the opposite direction from where he is with Reagan, to the point of being on Bush's back for a couple albums and a tour and a movie that he made, strongly coming out against George W. Bush. At the same time, when Bush was in office, he recorded a pro-American post-9/11 song. So that sort of stirred up those sentiments at that time. That's politically. Musically, the contradictions typically people have kept in, he talks about in the mid-'70s, basically paraphrasing here, but veering off from the straight and narrow and going into the ditch, sort of musically and psychically. But somebody whose probably most popular song is a quasi-country folk song, Heart of Gold, and that's what he's known for a lot of people still, sort of this AM radio person. And then the flip side of that is releasing something like Arc, almost an hour of straight noise. So being a from very gentle and mellow and romantic to being the exact opposite of that. So he always going in different directions, and you don't know which way he's going to be going next.
When we were exchanging emails, I said Harvest Moon from 1992 is probably my favorite Neil album. Mm-hmm. Very mellow, leaning more towards his folk roots. You said you're a fan of his harder stuff, and that speaks to that musical contradiction. As you write, he's the sensitive acoustic guy who can also make your ears bleed, as you write, when he plugs in. And you never know what to expect with each album that he puts out.
Right. That's definitely true. And it hasn't shown any signs of waning in his elder statesman period right now. We were talking a little bit about the new album, Barn, and the two songs that are out there. One's a laid-back country song, and the other one is much more aggressive and still rocking. And that's to say it's only two sides. There's lots of shades in the spectrum in the middle, too.
We were talking about Barn just before we started recording, and that's coming out December the 10th, and he has put out a couple of songs. Song of the Seasons is the one that I got a chance to listen to. Right. You said there's a second one that's, I don't know if I can...
I think Heading West is the other song that's out there right now.
Oh, it is. Okay. Another interesting point you bring up in the preface in this book is this idea of Neil's fierce individualism. Yes, he does what he wants to, but he doesn't do what he does on his own.
Yeah, it's another one of those contradictions where he continually goes back for support and camaraderie, I guess, for community, where the major bands we know, the Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, and he goes back to them. Crazy Horse goes back to them fairly often. But there's countless small bands along the way, the Restless, the Ducks, the Shocking Pink. So a lot of these are permutations of some of these other players, but he typically is part of something bigger. And unlike a lot of other artists, I would say he does typically give credit for these other people, where at least they get a band name. They're not just his nameless backing band. He lets people know that he's working with other people.
You cover interviews with Neil from 1967 through 2019. Did you pick up any things that changed throughout the years with him in these interviews? Any particular consistencies with him throughout the years regarding his comments? You know, he's a little rough in the beginning, and then as time goes on, he knows how to play the game. But anything that stands out to you? Yeah,
the through line, there's probably a couple different through lines there, but I think the early material, I don't know if I'd put him in the category of genius, but I'm tempted to do so. Some of the research on genius is that people have maybe 4 or 5 years where they're truly at their artistic peak. And during that time, they can't bother to do anything else. What they do is work, and they create, and they experiment, and they just produce lots and lots of material. And I think during that time, which I would put at the early mid-70s, although I think he had a number of periods that are just amazing artistically, he was shy and was interested in literally doing his own thing. And he didn't have time to talk with anyone else or to take the time to put other people into his mindset. So a lot of those times when he does talk during the 70s, it's with people he already knows. So he feels comfortable there. I think we see that start to change in the early 80s when he does start to talk more. There's a couple different reasons there. One is that he signs on with Geffen Records, which ends up being a bit of a disaster, but he does realize that he needs to start to promote his work. His work isn't going to sell itself. There's lots of changes in the record industry in 81, 82, 83, where big names didn't carry as much weight as they used to, and he had to sort of get with the program a little bit. But at that same time, he's dealing with his son's disabilities. So he ends up experimenting. Well, first of all, sort of re-realizing the place of family and the importance of family, and that changes what he talks about and what he thinks about. He also starts to think about ways that he can communicate with his son, so he gets interested more so in electronic means of communication. He was, if you read the interviews earlier on, he was interested in this stuff. It just really came out in the early 80s. So that starts to change what he's interested in, what he talks about. He's always reticent to not talk about the meaning of the songs. That's up to the listener to decide. He will talk about how some songs were recorded and the circumstances, but he typically won't talk about the songs themselves. And that's something that holds through the whole time. And then I'd say for the larger arc, so some of those things are incorporated. So he ends up talking about family. He always ends up talking about, people ask him about Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, about being a political songwriter and performer. And eventually, at some point, he gets to a point where he realizes that he can take advantage of this and starts selling products, I guess, so to speak, and things like Pono, and really starting to use his connection with people as a bully pulpit, I guess is what it would come down to.
How about surprises? I know I was surprised to see his comments on Charles Manson in the book.
The Manson stuff is, I'd read some of that stuff before. What I think is interesting is that he is unapologetic about hanging out with Manson, that he was a talented and charismatic person. And so he doesn't really make apologies for hanging out with him, as some people might, and obviously can't take responsibility for what happened. But it's, interesting. He wasn't the only one. The Beach Boys were involved, and a number of other performers were involved. I think the surprises for me end up being some of those things, like I said, how early he was into technology. When he's talking in the mid 70s, I believe it is, he takes a deep dive into recording and microphones and the process of releasing an album. So a lot of people think of him as somebody who has railed against digital recording and digital reproduction, but his first solo album, Neil Young, was an experiment in sound that was a horrible failure. It was pushed on him by Warner executives, and since that time he's had a chip on his shoulder about technology and the use of technology. But again, one of these contradictions, he seems like the person who's against digital technology, but he's one of the first people who embraced it and was using it. I found all of that to be very interesting. Some of these things that seem like more recent concerns of his go way back to the beginning.
And let's go back to the beginning. The book starts off with an interview by the Los Angeles Times, September 17th of 1967. This interview took place after the summer of 67 release of the single Bluebird with Mr. Soul on the B-side, and I love Mr. Soul. This is also just prior to October's Buffalo Springfield again. You write, quote, Young responds to a perpetual predicament, being asked to explain a song's meaning. And he's more effusive than later, but still prefers to discuss circumstances rather than meaning. And there we see right from the beginning, that's Neil, as you said, not wanting to talk about the actual meaning behind a song. He prefers that the listener interpret it their own way.
Yeah, I think, like I said, he did let his guard down a little bit there. And there are times when he says something, but that's something I really respect about him, is that he doesn't go into that. He's not going to put out the DVD version, the director's cut, explaining what every song means. He very much views it as an art and a craft and something that should stand on its own. So he respects the process, and he hopes that fans will also respect the process. I get the impression that that was a rough time period on him, that transition. The band was breaking up around that time, and so I think he was frustrated with their lack of widespread success. So I think, some of that might come out in that interview also.
I love his quote, just because I wrote a song doesn't mean I know anything. That's like the athletes who will say, just because I can slam dunk a basketball or hit a home run, don't make me a role model.
Well, yeah, I think that's where he's going with that quote. But as I said, I think at some point he realizes that, I don't necessarily think he enjoys having that power, but he realizes what he says does matter and can matter. Later on, he still doesn't explain what the songs mean, but he does feel free to let people know about his politics and what he thinks about the world. As in those early days when he's willing to do interviews with friends that end up being a little bit more just like hanging around and talking. I think he's willing to engage in interviews where it's hanging around and talking. Here's what I think. What do you think? And that's where his explaining or telling people about things happens, not within the art.
Yeah, I have a feeling that those who interview him it's hit or miss. He's either going to feel comfortable with them and open up, or not at all. Because there is one interview that we'll get to where a lot of one-word answers.
Yeah, there's also a non-interview, a non-interview interview that I didn't have space for. That was Neil just being very curt, and the gist of it was, okay, I'm here. You got this time with me. Let's get it on. And the interviewer wouldn't have a part of it, and like, this guy's a jerk, and that was the end of it. He wrote up that experience, but I didn't have space.
What year would this be?
I think it was late 80s. I left it out, not necessarily to, save face or anything for Neil, but it was more looking at interviews. I did try to include a lot of Neil's own words, and there just wasn't enough there ultimately to merit including it.
He could have been in that phase where he was, because I believe he talks about it might be in the 90s or the 2000s. His days of doing multiple interviews in a day are over, being asked the same questions and having to answer them the same way. This is it. You got it right here, and people are going to have to go find this interview. So around that time, who knows? That could have been his 10th interview that day, and he's just like, oh man, same questions.
Yeah, I was talking with somebody recently, and they were complaining about movie stars and rock stars complaining about the press. And I certainly understand that. Nobody really wants to hear that. But after doing this research and, looking at interviews that Neil's had since 1965, you can understand where somebody, especially who's been around that long, on occasion would get a little upset with just having to hear the same things over and over, the same questions over and over. And the natural response might be, I've said this 10 times, go and read this interview and see what I said. It's a little understandable. And I guess the flip side of that is that it's amazing at times the patience that he and other entertainers do have when they do have to sit down for a press junket and, sit in a room for 12 hours and just talk to people.
I'm sure they've gotten burned a few times here and there. Somebody's misquoted them, or they took something they said and twisted it around, and that can make them hesitant to do interviews. Yeah,
I'm working on a Prince interview book right now too, and there's a lot of parallels there where around the time of 1999, the album, there was a 1 or 2 days where he was scheduled to do 4 interviews, and he did one and he said, I'm not doing any more. And that was it. And then over the next 7 years, he did 3 more interviews because he was just done with it, sick of getting misquoted. And like Neil, he was too busy doing everything, being up 25 hours a day, whatever, recording. So I think there are parallels between the two of them.
But it is a necessary evil, because then if you don't get out there and let people know that you have a new product out there, a lot of people may never end up even knowing it existed. So it's that back and forth.
Yep.
We move on to an interview in January of 1969, and this is when Neil embarks on a solo career. Now, here Neil is opening up some more. Interesting that he anticipates the Kent State tragedy by a year and a half. What are your thoughts on this interview?
In these interviews and some of the ones that I didn't end up using, there's a touch of paranoia in those early articles, but he was in the middle of a lot that was going on, especially For What It's Worth. The Buffalo Springfield song, Paranoia, and all that stuff was happening then. So I think he was attuned to what was going on. And again, even though he was perceived as part of the counterculture, he was sort of a step away and was rightfully a little bit concerned with a lot of the stuff that was going on. So he didn't necessarily see revolution as the answer or the best way towards change. Perhaps some other ways might be better. In the 1973 interview with R. Mitchell Reed, he also has some of those concerns, especially with rock concerts just getting too large and things getting out of hand. And so there is that concern of things getting out of hand, I guess, is what it comes down to.
His quote, he says, the voting power isn't in the youth, but the manpower is. Who elected Richard Nixon, the United States? I didn't elect him. The voting power isn't in the youth, but the manpower is. It's not going to happen easy. It's not going to go away. It's just inevitable. That's all I can say. I love, by the way, that this is so late 60s. The interviewer says, okay, well, it's been groovy talking with you.
Yeah.
And then Neil says, it was out of sight talking with you. I love it.
Yeah, it's great stuff. The stuff that I always get a laugh out of is him talking about his old lady, which is just so so of the time.
Arthur Lizie's new book, Neil Young on Neil Young, Interviews and Encounters, is out now. All right, so now we get to the point where Neil Young heads for the ditch. You did bring this up. Want to get into this some more. You write, congratulations. You get to take a drink or put a marker on your Neil bingo card when this phrase appears. This is September of 1973. The one you just mentioned, it's with the legendary DJ B. Mitchell Reed. This is where, after a series of successful solo releases, Neil throws his first career curveballs. 72's Harvest went to number one. The single Heart of Gold, also number one, but he wasn't happy with going mainstream. That plus his Crazy Horse bandmate Danny Hutton died of an overdose. His friend and roadie Bruce Berry died of an overdose. His relationship with his girlfriend Carrie Snodgrass is strained. It's a dark time, and he eventually heads into what he calls the ditch. He ends up recording three of the darkest and most complex albums he ever recorded. Time Fades Away, Tonight's the Night, and On the Beach. What are your thoughts on that period?
It's just a time period when he was doing things that people didn't expect and at times didn't want. The other album that's in that period, and there's actually, I think, a couple albums in that period, but the other big one came out last year, Homegrown, which is it's ridiculously good. It fits in that. Bits and pieces of it had come out in different forms over the years, but it's of the time and fits in and I think holds up with any of those albums. Maybe not Tonight's the Night, but otherwise it does.
Now, in that 73 interview with B. Mitchell Reed, he does get into his relationship with David Crosby, which is intriguing. Reed asks if he was ever tight with David. Neil's response, not surprising. They weren't all that tight as friends. Have they ever gotten along? Right now, they're not getting along, right? Crosby had some...
No, they're excessively not getting along right now.
This was over Daryl Hannah, and because Neil divorced his wife, Peggy, and Crosby wasn't happy about that. A lot of back and forth jabs there. Did they ever get along?
It doesn't seem like they ever really got along. And it's unclear whether Crosby ever really wanted to work with him or not. They just seemed to clash the whole time.
We know he's always gotten along with Stephen Stills. That's his best bud. He gets along with Graham Nash too, right?
Yeah, I don't think it's antagonistic. I think it's more, I don't know if they necessarily care is what it seems like. But yeah, his closest relationship was historically with Stephen Stills, and the album Long May You Run is actually a Stills Young Band album. It's the two of them, and they went out on tour for that in, I want to say, 76. And in the middle of the tour, Neil just left. So he left Stills high and dry, but they got back together. So
I do remember David Crosby talking about that album they made, the first CSNY album, Deja Vu, 1970. Each member wrote their own songs, recorded them separately. I think maybe one or two songs, they were all in the same studio together.
Yeah, I think it was mostly like a White Album type thing where they're occasionally session musicians for each other or just laying down tracks. I think that was put together by their managers with money dangling in front of them, and they were made an offer they couldn't refuse, and they went back to that offer a number of times.
Speaking of that, what did you think of the late 80s album they did, American Dream?
I can't listen to it. Even that song, American Dream, the production on it just drives me crazy.
Very 80s, right? The synthesizers.
Yeah. I don't like the harmonies on it, but a lot of 80s stuff, it's hard to actually hear the songs underneath some of the production. Often I can. American Dream, I don't know, maybe if he came out and played it solo acoustic, it would be something I'd say, oh, yeah, okay, so that's the song that it should have been. It's hard to get through that.
Well, you're definitely not alone. The critics didn't like it, from what I recall. But
yeah, and it was at a time where it's not as if his solo or Crazy Horse stuff was really that great either. So it sort of was not only that came out, but it was around the same time as Life and Landing on Water. And it was like, okay, has he lost it here? What's going on?
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Time to check out some of the new and upcoming Books on Rock releases. Fillmore East, the venue that changed rock music forever, by Frank Mastropolo, was released on November 10th through Edgar Street Books. Journalist and photographer Frank Mastropolo interviewed more than 90 of Fillmore East's musicians and crew members to write this oral history of the legendary venue in New York City's East Village. The oral history features more than 200 images and performance photos, posters, letters, buttons, contracts, and memorabilia, many never before published. Bowie Odyssey 71 by Simon Goddard was released on November 11th through Omnibus Press. Simon Goddard continues his groundbreaking immersive narrative of the world around David Bowie. Through the second year of the decade, he changed pop forever. Timeless Concert Images, the Definitive Collection by Bill O'Leary came out on hardcover November 16th. Acclaimed rock photographer Bill O'Leary is back with his fifth book overall. This hardcover 400-plus pager compiles Bill's first two books, Timeless Concert Images and Timeless Concert Images 2, and adds 52 additional photos, as well as 2 new bands, for a total of 100 bands. Featured are countless renowned classic rock artists: Queen, Pink Floyd, Scorpions, the Allman Brothers Band, Rush, Van Halen, Foreigner, Styx, AC/DC, Bob Seger, Def Leppard, Whitesnake, The Police, Motley Crue, Frank Zappa, Grateful Dead, Judas Priest, Kiss, Ozzy Osbourne, ZZ Top, and many, many more. Just released this week, Jimi Hendrix Voodoo Child by Harvey and Ken Kubernick. Came out November 23rd through Sterling Books. A unique tribute to Jimi Hendrix featuring contributions by those who knew and worked with him, enhanced with images by the most renowned rock photographers of the era. Just released today, November 26th, Tori Amos Every Album, Every Song by Lisa Torum. Released through Sonic Bond Publishing. This is a track-by-track analysis of Tori Amos's essential recorded works, starting from her late 1980s synth-pop beginnings through to 2017's illuminating Native Invader. John Prine's John Prine by Aaron Osmond, due out on paperback through Bloomsbury Academic on November 30th. Part of a series of books titled 33 and a Third, this book marks the 50th anniversary of John Prine's self-titled debut album release. It chronicles the legendary singer-songwriter's middle American provenance and his remarkable ascent from singing mailman to celebrated son of Chicago. And due out December 1st through Backbeat Books is U2's The Joshua Tree, Planting Roots in Mythic America by Bradley Morgan. This book explores the political, social, and cultural themes rooted in U2's classic album The Joshua Tree, when it was originally released in 1987, and how those themes resonated as a response to the election of Donald Trump when U2 toured for the album's 30th anniversary. Find a link to all the newest and upcoming Books on Rock releases in this episode's show notes page and on our website, bookedonrock.com. Let's go back to the early 80s. This is the most baffling period of Neil's career. October 2nd, 1982 is the interview that you feature here. The interview is by New Musical Express, and I love the way these interviews are set up. By the way, you begin with when we last left our hero, and quite a bit has happened since then. From the mid-'70s through late 70s, he was still releasing some great music. Long May You Run, American Stars and Bars, Comes a Time, Rust Never Sleeps. But Neil is going through some struggles as we hit the 80s. He and his wife Peggy had a son in 1978, Ben. He was born with cerebral palsy. And this takes Neil out of the music and out of the game for a while. Can you talk about what happened during that period of the late 70s into the new decade?
He actually has a huge success, at least musically has a huge success at the end of the 70s with Rust Never Sleeps and Live Rust. And for me, that was sort of the other way I hooked in with him. When I was a kid in the mid-70s, I sat in the back of my parents' car and heard AM radio and heard stuff like Heart of Gold. But later on, I was able to, when I was coming of age, I heard that stuff. I'm like, wow, okay, this is some pretty amazing heavy stuff. You know, what he can do with a guitar. Quickly after that, he did stuff like Reactors in there. And so there's sort of decent stuff, but not as A quality, but solid B quality. But he did end up getting dropped from his label. And part of that was not because he wasn't going to tour, but he wasn't touring because he had to be at home to help with his child, born with a disability. So he wouldn't tell the label why he wasn't going out and playing live. So they get mad at him. So it just sort of devolved at that period. At the same time, his marriage is breaking apart. So he ends up leaving Warner Brothers and ends up going on to Geffen Records at this time. Geffen was part of that. He was involved in that earlier period at times when Neil was given offers he couldn't refuse to go out and tour with Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, and he's given another offer he couldn't refuse with a amazing contract. But Neil quickly starts producing what Geffen says are not Neil Young records. So he puts out a country album. He puts out an electronic album influenced by Kraftwerk. A couple albums don't come out during this time period that Geffen wouldn't even release. They're supposedly going to be released in the next year or two, hopefully. So he's just producing lots and lots of material that the label is angry about, and they end up suing him. We start to hear, I mentioned his support for Reagan, which becomes a large part of the narrative in the 1980s. And I think a little bit of that is also him thinking about making that break with the past, where he's not going to be Neil Young, this hippie counterculture person. He's going to be this new person. I think it's purposeful, and I think we talk about him being authentic. At the same time, I think there is a level of him acting or putting on a persona, especially during this period. And he starts with songs on Reactor being anti-union and basically starting to be down on the left and liberalism. And that sort of comes through after he goes through the rockabilly album and that electronic album. He ends up with the country album and ends up becoming a country performer and a redneck. So it just all, if you wrote this as a screenplay that this artist was doing this, somebody would think it's unbelievable that nobody would actually do this, that maybe they would make one career misstep and then they figure out a way to be who they need to be. But this was just over and over again. And I don't even want to call it a career. A career misstep is wrong. He was doing what he wanted to do. Commercial missteps, I would say that.
Yeah, that 1982 album, Trans. I think of Kiss, Music from the Elder, which was like the year before that, where the fans expect something, they drop the needle, and it is nothing like what they thought it would be. It features an electronic sound. Neil puts his voice through a Sennheiser vocoder. But it's interesting. All Music gives it 2 out of 5 stars, but Rolling Stone, 4 out of 5. The Village Voice, an A-. And even Neil defended it in a 1995 interview you include in the book. He said, although there were technical problems on the album, the content was great. What do you think of Trans?
I love it.
Okay.
It's one of my go-to albums. As I said, there are other albums that didn't get released during that time. And there's a couple songs on there from some of that stuff. And I think it throws off the balance of the album because it's sort of old Neil stuff rather than being a 100% album of electronic stuff. Some of that is probably nostalgia and sentiment. As I said, this was when I was really coming of age, and this is when I was really getting into Neil. And I was baffled, totally baffled at the time, but I did enjoy it. And this is one of those ones where I think when you listen to some of the songs, either acoustically, he did do some on Unplugged, something like Transformer Man. It's a great song and it stands up on its own. But I think when you go and you listen to some Neil stuff from across the ages, and one of those songs is plunked in there, it stands out, but I think it also makes sense sort of in the overall flow. It's unusual, but I don't think it's necessarily out of character. And I think he did the electronics right. He didn't, unlike the later 80s albums with Crazy Horse, where it's filling out the sound and it's replacing innovation in production. He embraced it, and it's what he is doing. It's not an add-on. It's not like, here's my song and there's technology on top of it, but here's my technology song. And I think that's a lot different than sort of, I'm going to do this, but I'm going to do it with a Latin beat because people will be interested. And I think it's that same type of integrated thinking or recording that for me works.
You mentioned some releases that could be coming out, songs that Neil recorded during those early Geffen years. What can we expect from those?
There's a couple different things in there. The country album around that time is Old Ways. So there's a different version of Old Ways in that stuff. There's one called, it's Islands. I've seen a couple different names for it. I think it's finally settled on Islands. And it's a little unclear what that material is. It's not hard rock. I think it's more mellow, but it's not necessarily country or folk mellow. I think it's going to be when it comes out, it'll be a little bit of different side of Neil that we haven't. So it will be a different version of Neil that I don't think we've heard before.
Do we know when these are coming out?
I don't remember. A lot of the scheduled stuff has been pushed back because of the pandemic, although that gave him time to do a lot of the work. The release schedule ends up getting pushed back, especially with vinyl shortages and things like that. So I think that's going to be out maybe next year.
Okay.
For trance, the other thing I would recommend for trance to hear those songs a little differently is there's a video that I think was first on HBO called Berlin, and it's most of a live show from that time period with Nils Lofgren on guitar. That gives you a little bit different take on some of those songs.
A few years later, Neil would be at war with his label Geffen, as you talked about. That legal battle starts to subside, and then you have this interview in 1985. And there's a quote in here that stands out for me regarding his appreciation for his fans that I want to get your thoughts on. Neil doesn't play only what he wants to play. He's thinking about the fans, at least live. He says, I do Sugar Mountain really for the people more than I do it for myself. I think I owe it to them because it seems to really make them feel happy. So that's why I do that. They pay a lot of money to come and see me, and I lay a lot of things on them that they've never heard before, and I think I owe it to them to do things they can really identify with. How much, if any of that quote, do you attribute to the backlash he received for his early 80s musical decisions? Or is that just entirely separate? What he does in the studio, what he does live? Is he more willing to share and do things for the fans live?
I definitely think so. That's another thing throughout the book. He appreciates the fans early on, certainly on a personal level, when he's still able to have interpersonal reactions with them. But later on, he realizes, especially performing live, that he gets the juice back from them if they're happy. And typically, the fans are usually happy with what he's doing, so it's a good synergy. So I think he does truly appreciate the fans, and that's probably another thing. Notice just how much he does talk about them. They are a part of his thought process. Maybe not in the studio, not when he's creating, but certainly outside the studio, they're part of what he thinks about. Even, I think it changed for everybody after Lennon was killed, but, even the people who come and would hassle him at his house or at his ranch, he understood where they were coming from. It wasn't leave me alone, be a jerk, but more empathetic. I think the only time that Neil did it for the fans, and I think there was some tension there for him and he sort of regretted it, was with the Unplugged album. That was very much okay, this is what people are doing now. You should come in and do this. It's easy money. You just record some of your songs people know. And I think that led to a bit of friction for him.
It wasn't genuine?
Yeah.
He talks about his connection to Charles Manson in that 1985 interview with Adam Sweeting of Melody Maker. And I brought this up last week, actually, during an interview with author William McKean, who wrote a great book in 2017 called Everybody Had an Ocean, Music and Mayhem in 1960s Los Angeles. He met him through Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys. He tried getting Charlie signed to Warner Brothers. He was still trying to come to terms in this 1985 interview with what happened and how he got drawn into Manson's world. It's a quote he has here. He says, there is a saying that if you don't look the devil in the eye, you're all right. But once you've looked him in the eye, you'll never forget him. And there will always be more devil in you than there was before. And then he goes on, it's hard to say, the devil is not a cartoon character. Like God is on one side of the page and he's on the other. The devil lives in everyone and God lives in everyone. There's no book that tells you when the devil said to God, fuck you, and God said, and then he makes a raspberry noise. All those books that are written are just one person's opinion. What do you make of those comments?
I guess I take them at face value. And for me, it sort of goes back to issues with fans. One of the things that happened in the mid-2000s when he was basically out there against George W. Bush, he earnestly tried to engage his fans who were supporters of Bush and tried to talk with them and understand their point of view for things that sort of the same type of situation where on the outside, he was probably thinking, I can't imagine you believe that. How can you believe that? Here are the facts. And so he tried to talk and interview with people who were sort of on the other side of the fence. And I think that comes to that same mentality there, or really that idea of empathy. that he does have for other people and particularly for his fans, in that he ends up not being very judgmental. And I think part of that comes from something like, well, okay, I believe Manson was a nice guy and I tried to get him signed to a record label. Who am I to say somebody shouldn't be doing X or Y? I can engage them and find out why they do it, maybe try to change their mind, but they're ultimately in their own head. I can't be in their head.
A lot of those guys, they were hanging with him. Jim Morrison supposedly knew Charles Manson.
Yeah, I guess you can't necessarily see the future on one hand. I mean, there's probably some warning signs there, but I can just imagine he was very charismatic. Obviously, he was charismatic. He was able to convince people to do things that they shouldn't do. And I guess I can understand, especially in maybe a more fluid living environment or an environment where that isn't judgmental, where you might end up hanging out with somebody who's a friend of a friend, and you say, okay, oh, this guy's fine, and not really checking them out, and then these type of things can happen.
Plus, we're talking late 60s, so a lot of characters.
Yeah.
Journalist Dave Zimmer of San Francisco's BAM magazine describes Neil as the Robert De Niro of rock and roll in the 1988 interview featured in this book, saying he's continually transformed himself musically throughout his career. You'll also include some great isolated quotes from other various interviews throughout this book. One you include from 1988 in an interview with Rock and Folk, Neil Young on the age of his audience, and he says, quote, "Couldn't give a flying one. I'm not George Michael. I'm an old jerk. I am beyond that. Teens can listen to my records if they want. Why not? It's sincere music. It's tried and true music. It's music that transcends age group. But if they consider that at their age, it's more fun to listen to George Michael, fine." How did you go about choosing which of these standout quotes to add in this book?
Well, some of it's highlights from some of those articles I said I wasn't able to include. So I was very familiar with those articles and knew there were pieces that I wanted to get in there. I also, part of it is you can see it's in there by time period. So that was able to break it down on some of that. And there's a lot of there are interviews where he talks about something for what ends up being a paragraph on the page that he doesn't talk about necessarily in other articles.
How did you get access to all of these interviews? What was the process?
I had a lot of my own. I did extensive internet research, extensive work through numerous databases. Ended up tracking down the writers in a number of cases. A number of times, thinking, how did you find me? I'm like, well, this is what I'm doing, so I can find people. So it was a fun process. I got to use skills I had in research in the past, but I also learned some new skills. Relied on a few friends who have some dark art powers online and are able to find things. And
any legal challenges?
Yeah, the whole thing is a legal challenge. You can see there's copyright issues. The biggest issue often is trying to figure out who owns something. A lot of these publications have gone through multiple hands since the article came out. A lot of times they've gone out of business. So tracking down and trying to figure out who actually owns something is one of the most difficult parts of doing the book. And then whether or not somebody who published it owns it, who wrote it owns it, that's a huge part of what's going on.
How was Neil, by the way, with Rolling Stone? Did he have a good relationship with Rolling Stone? Has he had a good relationship over the years with them?
Yeah, he has. He was pals early on with a couple of the writers, and then one of the people who he gave access to when he wasn't talking to anybody else was Cameron Crowe. So he ended up talking with him. Those are not included. I did inquire about those, but Crowe is supposedly doing his own interview collection. So I wasn't able to secure the rights to that. But yeah, he generally had a really good relationship with Rolling Stone, and Rolling Stones was one of his biggest supporters over the years.
Now we move on to 1989. Neil, not exactly the MTV pinup idol, and he would be the first to admit that, but he gains new fans with the song Rockin' in the Free World. He made a video for the song, which I remember seeing often back in the day. A lot of airplay on rock radio. The song, inspired by the political changes going on at the time, it was released a few months before the fall of the Berlin Wall and became an anthem for the event as freedom spread throughout Eastern Europe. And you include an interview from 1990 with Broken Arrow, where he's asked by writer Alan Jenkins, what do you think about the fact that Rockin' in the Free World is turning into some sort of anthem in the wake of what has happened in the world over the last 9 months, especially China and Eastern Europe? Neil quickly responds with, no comment. Quite a few one-word answers and quick comebacks in this one. He seems irritated by the questions, but then again, you're not picking up on the tone of voice, but it certainly seems that way. What happened in this interview?
The dynamics of that interview, I think, are part of what's going on there. Broken Arrow is the publication of the NYAS, which is the Neil Young Appreciation Society. So it's a unauthorized magazine that came out for a number of years, mimeographs, and then it progressed a little bit more and had a beautiful color cover for a number of years. So he didn't give a lot of interviews with people from Broken Arrow. So it sort of seems a little bit more like he tolerated them and decided he was going to give them an interview. They didn't talk to him very much. So I think there's a little bit of that in there. He was, at times he was a little upset because they would publish song lyrics before the songs came out and have reports of unreleased songs, all that type of stuff. So there was a bit of a tenuous relationship between him and the, I don't want to, not aggressive, but really the super fans or the ultra fans. And I think that's why, a little bit why he gets that response. But I think it's also not wanting to explain or really not quite knowing. I think that's a time period when he decides he does get political there, but he's sort of turning the corner and he becomes a little bit apolitical after that for a while.
Arthur Lizie's book, Neil Young on Neil Young, Interviews and Encounters, released on November 9th. Quite the way for Andrew Hultkrantz to lead his 1992 interview article with Neil. He says, quote, Neil Young is the definitive axe murderer. Wow. He continues, his backwoods psychotic glare and tremulous sneer render Jack Nicholson milquetoast by comparison. A torture of the Les Paul and Fender amp, Neil is a study in frenzy and distortion. A Neil Young solo is the sound of electricity suffocating. What an opening.
Yeah.
This is the period Neil is considered the godfather of grunge, Pearl Jam being maybe the most vocal about their appreciation for Neil. His Mojo interview from 1995 is interesting because he talks about Kurt Cobain in this, and you introduce it by noting how he was recording an album when Kurt Cobain committed suicide, quoting Neil's "It's better to burn out than to fade away" in his farewell note. Neil wrote the song Sleeps with Angels as a response. He wasn't a fan of these bands. He talks in this interview about working with Pearl Jam, being a fan of Sonic Youth. And as far as Nirvana, he was a fan, right?
He was. I think he didn't necessarily listen to them as much as some of those other bands, certainly Pearl Jam. But yeah, I mean, he's always been sort of hip to some of the major things happening with other bands. So he definitely would have noticed them. And at that time period, he had started to go into a little bit more into the festival world. So I think they ended up running into people and encountering different bands in that way also.
He gained a new audience, a younger audience, because of that. Kids that were Pearl Jam fans, they were starting to listen to Neil's music just because Eddie Vedder was talking about him in concert. He used to call him Young Neil. This is one of the bootlegs I have. He'd call him Young Neil. He did pick up on a whole new generation of fans in the 90s.
Yeah, he certainly got revitalized at that period, playing shows with a different band, not bringing Crazy Horse out, but doing some similar type of stuff live. I think he was challenged in some different ways that he hadn't been before musically. He expanded his audience there, and I think he kept quite a bit of it also, where he went back from the early, the Ragged Glory and then into the Harvest Moon stuff and then back to the rock stuff, sort of balancing that stuff out.
Sticking with Pearl Jam here, he had a great quote about celebrity in this interview. He said, quote, back in the 50s and 60s, rock and roll was big, but it was only big to people who cared about it. Now it's big to people who don't care about it, so they can't begin to understand it. He also says something about Eddie Vedder. He says, who else do you know who's his age and going through the things he's going through? because he just wants to make music for a living and travel around a bit. Hopefully, though, he'll get used to it. People will get used to him being around, and they'll leave him alone a little more. He's pretty spot on with that prediction.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, interesting aspect of these interviews in the 90s and beyond. There's the wisdom now that Neil has. Guy's been around for a while. He's been a celebrity for a while. He seems to get it by this point.
Yeah, I think like I said, in the early 80s, he starts to take more control of the interviews. By the mid 90s, he's also starting to receive different types of questions, I think, at this point, where it's maybe not always his view on what's happening or the politics of the moment, but some of those bigger question issues that eventually become things like talking about the environment. But also, as he said, that, there's a realization that he's been around a while and has a different perspective on some of this stuff.
He admits to being out of touch in the 80s. Basically, he felt lost. He said, quote, "I didn't dare to touch what was inside of me." He's talking about the 80s, and he comes a long way. And then we get this quote in the same interview where he talks about, just like you say, he's in control now of the interviews. He said, "Even yesterday, I didn't know if I wanted to meet you. But when I'm talking to you, it's different from talking to 10 anonymous journalists who come from all over Europe." So this was an interview I think he did with, I'm going to probably butcher this name, Zurich Weltwoche. Is that the name of the magazine or the newspaper?
Yeah.
Am I close enough?
Yeah, close enough.
Close enough. He says, "Even yesterday, I didn't know if I wanted to meet you, but when I'm talking to you, it's different from talking to 10 anonymous journalists who come from all over Europe. Now I do just one interview. I'm sitting around with you and having a proper conversation, but doing this 10 times a day, I can't. I don't have to, and I won't do that. I've talked to you, and if anybody is interested, they have to read what you write. If you ask the right questions, you'll get the information you want. If not, you're the idiot, not me." Yeah. That's Neil Young. He doesn't candy coat it. Yeah, he really seemed to, as we get to the 2000s, questions and answers, they start to shift now. Now they're asking how he stays passionate at his age and how he stays driven to create after so many years, about getting older. His political concerns are now reawakened during the George W. Bush years. And he's also addressing the changing platforms in which music is delivered. One quote from 2004 about file sharing. He says, quote, "I can't control what people do. I don't want to. If they want to sell my music to someone else or send it to their friends, they can just as easily tape it off the radio as the net," which I found interesting because basically his issue hasn't been file sharing. His issue is the sound quality that comes out of file sharing.
Yeah, he's, as I said, from early on, he's been very concerned about sound quality. And one of the reasons why the archives were delayed supposedly was that he wasn't able to put them out in a form that he wanted them to be out in. So, I mean, he's still on this concern about how it should be, how we should hear things. And right now, the proper way to hear things is through Neil Young archives with high res quality. So that's his suggestion that's how you should be listening to stuff right now.
He tried promoting Pono music, and that was something he developed, which was a download service, dedicated music player, high quality. This was designed to compete against MP3s and some other formats, but it didn't do as well as he hoped. He did go out there and try to promote. I think this is when he was on Howard Stern. Is that still around, Pono music, or did it?
No, that got shut down. Yeah, it was, he had a number of experimental things like that, especially in the 2000s that he tried to do. Well, obviously people didn't want it, is what it comes down to.
Did you get it? Did you try it?
I did not.
I didn't either.
I did not.
It was expensive.
Yeah, it was, the price point was too expensive, and I don't think there was enough product differentiation from the other players and music that was out there. I think most people care about sound quality to a point. There's always going to be audiophiles and people who will talk about wave rate and digitization and compression. And, you go into a record store and say compression out loud, duck. And there's always going to be those audiophiles. But I think for most people, good enough is good enough. So
I used to go by the bit rate. If it's 128, not good. 192, that's pretty good. get up to
Yeah.
320 and then it's good. I'm sure he's got ears that are very different than the average person too. As a musician, he's listening to things that the average person isn't going to pick up on. But God bless him for trying, man. He, the music is so important to him. That's for sure.
And in the last interview, he actually gets on the writer, who's also a musician, for recording in the studio with headphones on, and that saying that he's not really getting the sound of the studio and the room, which I do agree with. But I like that interview, that Tom Power interview from 2019, because he just gets into talking with music about somebody. And I think that's a fun one, and goes to some of his concerns about sound quality.
Let's talk about Neil as a guitarist as we wind down here. He's got a great quote about Jimi Hendrix in your book. That's the one thing about Neil. He's got some quotes, man, that are really cool, really powerful. And what he said about Jimi Hendrix, he said, quote, "Hendrix is the best. Nobody can touch him. I'm a hack compared to him, a hack. That guy, it slipped off his hands. He couldn't help himself. I've got to go in there and hack away with a machete to get through what he just walked through." That's an awesome quote. He doesn't have to say it, but I'll say it. He's no hack. Neil's no hack. What do you think of him as a guitarist?
I think he's amazing as a guitarist. I'm not a guitarist. I've dabbled in guitar, but I'm not a guitarist, so I can't necessarily judge on certain terms. When it comes down to it, what matters is the sound you get out of your instrument. For me, and I think for most people, whether they play it properly or well or classically, or they just picked it doesn't matter. It matters the sound you get out of it, and the sounds that he is able to get out of it and what he's able to express with that. It's all something that no one else has done in that way. And so I think that makes him a great guitarist. I'm talking electric. I think his acoustic stuff is, sort of a different order. And I think it's good, but I don't think it's, for me, as different from what other people do as his electric stuff is.
Well, he's got to be doing something right, because this quote came from an interview that Guitar World did with him, 2009. So if Guitar World is interviewing you, you're doing something right. You're good enough. But here he says to Richard Beanstalk in this interview, he sucks. What does he think of himself as a songwriter?
Well,
is he the tortured artist?
I think he was early on. I think early on, especially that Buffalo Springfield stuff, I think some of that stuff is labored. I think some of the stuff on the first album is a little bit labored. I think he takes off after those first couple ones. But at some point, he just ends up making a go of it. And it doesn't necessarily, whether it's good or not, doesn't matter to him, I think. I think he just needs to get it out there. That's one of the beefs he has with Crosby at some point, is that Crosby ends up being precious about songs. And I'm not exact here, but basically something like, in a year, Crosby would write 5 songs and he'd treat them like gentle children. And Neil's like, what the hell are you doing? You just got to keep writing. When you're done writing a song, you record it. And it's either good or bad. If it's good, you use it. If it's bad, you just save it and do something else with it. Or at some point it will be good. So he's really of the mind, certainly by the 70s, where it's more important to simply get it out there and get it on tape rather than care whether it's good or not, or it's you've perfected your craft or created a work of art.
I told you my favorite Neil Young album is Harvest Moon from 1992. What is your favorite Neil Young album? Solo or with CSNY or whatever?
Man, that is really hard. It's one of those things that changes all the time. Yeah. I would say the one I go back to, I do go back to Trans a lot, but I can't say it's necessarily the favorite. Probably if I had to pick one, it would be Rust Never Sleeps. So I think that gives a good airing out of both of those major sides that I most appreciate for him.
He does enjoy talking about his dual guitar chemistry with his late great Crazy Horse bandmate Danny Hutton, and he sadly died of an overdose in 1972, 29 years old. That really rocked Neil. Not an easy topic for him to discuss. He refused to address any similarities between Danny and Kurt Cobain in one of the interviews you include. That was something that was kind of off the table there. He wasn't going to talk too much about Danny.
I think for all the openness, there are still private parts there. But I think that the interviewers don't necessarily know what those private parts and but Witten's probably one of those. And if they hit on that, he's not going to talk about it.
He was hard on himself for a while there because he fired Danny, and then the overdose happened shortly after.
The short version looks like he fired him and gave him the money to go out and kill himself. I mean,
right, that's right.
Putting it as blunt as possible. So I can only imagine what it was like. I obviously I don't think it's his fault, but I can only imagine you wouldn't feel complicit in it happening.
Did he give him the money specifically for that? I thought he gave it to him for something else, but he kind of
gave it to him for something else.
Yeah,
right.
But he knew in his head like Danny might use this for drugs.
Right. But I mean, I would imagine, you give it to him, then you think of, okay, I gave it to him. Did I do that just to get rid of him, or did I do it because I had better things to do? Was I not there for a friend? And I think those are the things that end up going through your mind when something like that happens.
The last interview you did say from 2019, Tom Power of CBC Radio for a podcast series called Q. What went into your decision to finish the book with this particular interview?
Well, part of it I didn't have quite as much Canadian content as I wanted. I tried a few different things that didn't work, or I wasn't able to get a hold of them. So I was pretty glad to be able to close it on a Canadian note, also right around the time that he actually became an American citizen. So it's sort of this sort of passing right there. But I found that interesting. I found it an interview that was very chatty, two musicians talking, and the interview really feels like it stops at one point, and then it's actually Neil who sort of picks it up again, and it ends up turning into something more personal and more interesting.
The Dan Rather interview is a fun one too. Dan Rather and the Howard Stern one. Were you surprised that he did Howard Stern? Maybe not, because by this time Stern was doing the more serious interviews.
I was probably more surprised at Dan Rather than at Howard Stern. And there's other ones I ended up leaving out, like Fresh Air. And there sort of became a point where he just ended up, just from how long he's been around and talking to different audiences, who his fans are, that he can pretty much talk to anyone at some point. So it didn't necessarily surprise me. Dan Rather's probably the one that maybe surprised me the most, but maybe more from Dan Rather's side than Neil's side.
I was going to say, we're finding out Dan's a rocker. He's had the Wilson sisters from Heart, and he's had Eddie Money, and thinking, he had Brian Johnson of AC/DC, and there's Brian talking about how he wrote Hell's Bells to Dan Rather. I thought that was the greatest. He's telling him, Dan, I looked up in the sky and I saw the thunder and lightning, and I thought, AC/DC, Dan Rather's a rocker.
I mean, it shouldn't be a surprise. I mean, when you think about Rather, and he was on the ground in Vietnam in the 60s and all the stuff that was happening then, it's not like he doesn't know life, so it's not surprising that he's into all this stuff.
They're great interviews though, because they are serious, and I'm sure the artists appreciate that. So Neil Young is now 76, new album due out next month called Barn. This is his 41st studio album. That's not a mistake. That's an accurate number. 41 studio albums. The single song of the season's released last month, and he sings, "In the water as it ripples in the wind, there's a message I see of what's to come." What do you think is to come from Neil Young in the second half of his 70s? What do you hope to see from him in the years to come? How much longer do you think he can go until he can't?
I think he's just going to keep going until he can't. I think these last two albums, or what I've heard of this album, and certainly Colorado, show no signs of any type of slowing down. And behind the scenes, he's very active, compiling his life. All the archive stuff, I know he's actively involved in that. So that's just amazing material coming out there, old live shows and videos and unreleased songs. And so he's curating all of that. So I expect he will keep going. And certainly with the acoustic stuff, he showed during the pandemic that all he has to do is set up a camera, light a fire, and sit down and pick up his guitar and play. As long as he can do that, he's going to be out there.
When was the last time you saw him live?
It's been a long time. It's been a while. I'll say that. He was supposed to tour summer 2020. When late February, early March 2020, he was on the verge of putting the tickets on sale for the summer 2020 tour, and that didn't happen. So
what was your first Neil Young concert? I didn't ask you.
Well, actually, the first time I saw him wasn't a Neil Young concert. It was at Live Aid. He performed there solo and with Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. So I saw him twice at that. So it was the first time I encountered him live. But then it wasn't until after that I saw him on the Freedom tour when he was getting, in some ways, back on his feet, so to speak, playing smaller places before he went back into the arenas. So my first show with him was an acoustic show. It was great stuff.
Neil Young on Neil Young Interviews and Encounters is out now through Chicago Review Press, and it's available wherever books are sold. Any websites you want people to check out to get a copy of the book, or is it just all the usual outlets?
Pretty much all the usual places.
Do you have your own website or social media pages you want to get out there?
The website's a work in progress, so
yeah.
It's
to be continued. That's keep an eye out for it.
Yeah.
And
on Instagram, yeah.
You're on Instagram, okay.
Yeah.
This is also part of a series of books, Musicians in Their Own Words, put out by Chicago Review Press. This is great stuff. David Bowie, The Clash, Kurt Cobain, Fleetwood Mac, George Harrison, Jimi Hendrix, Keith Richards, Led Zeppelin, John Lennon, Bruce Springsteen, The Who, and more. I'll put a link up to the page on Chicago Review Press's website if listeners want to check that out, and also a link to get a copy of the Neil Young book through Amazon. All right, Arthur, thanks so much for being on the podcast. Great talking Neil Young with you, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you very much.
Thanks to our guest, Arthur Lizie, for taking us through his book, Neil Young on Neil Young, Interviews and Encounters. If you have a local independent bookstore, pick up a copy there and support not just Arthur, but your local independent bookstore. A link to find your nearest bookstore on our show notes page and on our website, bookedonrock.com. Be sure to subscribe to Booked on Rock at Spreaker or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. We're on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, TuneIn, YouTube, and more. That website again, bookedonrock.com. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/bookedonrockpodcast. On Twitter at bookedonrock. The email address is thebookedonrockpodcast@gmail.com. If you're an author of a book on rock and you want to be on the podcast, just send me an email. I'm Eric Sanich. Thanks for listening, and join me again next time for another brand new episode of Booked on Rock.